Welcome to Edinburgh Culture Conversations, and thank you for joining us. My name is Janet Archer. I'm the Director of Festival, Cultural and City Events at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. I want to say a few thanks before we begin. Thank you to everyone at the university who's helped make this series happen, especially the Festivals, Culture and City Events team. And a special thank you to the artists, creatives, academics and cultural leaders who are contributing as panelists across the series, which forms part of the global debate on how to make sense of culture in this time of coronavirus. Thank you too to the Edinburgh Futures Institute, who are our partners for this event. EFI is all about bringing people together to solve global challenges and build a sustainable future, vitally important before COVID, but even more essential now. Thank you to Jill Gallagher and Greg Colloon from Just Sign, who have joined us for the whole series as our BSL interpreters. This series is taking place against the backdrop of the world's biggest festival city, successful because of its extraordinary community of festivals, large and small. 2020 is the first year since 1947 that the spring and summer festivals haven't been able to take place. It feels important to mark this moment and capture how the arts and creative sectors can help society recover from the effects of COVID-19. This year, people from around the world are engaging with the festivals in a different way through an impressive range of online work. The Edinburgh International Book Festival launched this weekend and is now delivering 140 events for adults, families and children online over the course of the next few weeks. The International Festival, the Fringe Society and the Edinburgh Art Festival are also presenting digital programmes showcasing some extraordinary work by artists from across disciplines. It's good that these programmes have been able to generate much needed employment at a time when coronavirus has sharply accentuated the tight margins most UK cultural organisations deal with. But it's hard to witness the devastating effect on a sector which last year was at the peak of its success and is now facing severe operational restrictions and, as a consequence, rapidly escalating job losses and the inevitable skills drain, which will make it harder to build up again in future. We talk a lot about the cost of the arts, but we don't always talk about their value. Today's conversation will explore why creativity matters, not just to the arts, but to our whole existence as human beings. We'll be discussing how the arts affect societal and cultural behaviours, and consider the question of whether culture and creativity can help build flourishing and inclusive societies, as well as powering the economy. We'll touch on creative education and how the arts foster individual talent, bring people together, and inspire the innovation essential in today's world. And we'll also talk about some of the challenges and inequalities in current systems, and importantly, explore what can be done to enable more people to benefit from the arts. So before we begin, I'd like to ask you as audience members to save your questions until about halfway through. I'll do my best to take as many as possible. I'm sure I won't get them all in, so please forgive me if we don't manage to answer all of your questions. To ask a question, use the Zoom Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen. We're recording the event, so please take that into account in asking and answering questions. And if you want to tweet, use the hashtag UOE Culture Conversations. That's UOE Culture Conversations. And be aware that the university's approach to ethics means that we're guided by the principles of dignity, respect for others, integrity, objectivity, and openness. I'd ask you to present questions in this context, and we will reserve the right to remove questions if they don't fit within this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guests for this evening, and I'm going to ask each to say a few words about themselves. I'm going to start with Dr. Clarence Adoo.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be with you and take part in this very important discussion. I've been a performer all my life in music, and that's predominantly playing the trumpet. 20 years ago, however, I had a near fatal car accident that left me with a broken neck and a damaged spinal cord, which means now I'm paralyzed from the neck downwards. Amazingly, I'm able to play an electronic instrument, which still allows me to participate with other fellow professional musicians. It also turned my interest to look at disabled young people and what opportunities and what could be done for them. So that's it. Basically, I'm based in Newcastle upon Tyne. I'm Sage Gateshead. I was connected with the architects in making sure that the design of the building was sufficient. And so, as I say again, I'm pleased to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Clarence. We're going to move on in alphabetical order by surname. So that's over to Leonie Bell.
Thank you, Janet, and hello, everybody. I'm currently working in Paisley, heading up a programme called Future Paisley, which is a regeneration programme which strives to think about regeneration in physical, social and economic terms. So we have a huge physical programme that's reimagining our major cultural buildings, museum, town hall, art centre, but we also have a big social, educational and I suppose people-led programme which extends culture into all sorts of different contexts. So I've only got another few weeks left in lovely Paisley before I head up to Dundee to be the second director of the Scotland's first design museum, V&A Dundee, and looking forward to the conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. Congratulations on your new role. And from Dundee, I'm going to bring in Drew Hammond.
Well, North Fife to be precise. Thanks, Janet, for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be here with so many amazing speakers. My name's Drew Hammond. I'm an artist, curator, and an academic researcher at the University of Edinburgh. My background, I was artistic director for 25 years of the UK's Festival for Digital Culture from 1995. I've set up a number of digital platforms for social good, most recently the Grow Observatory. And in Edinburgh, I'm one of the team who's working to establish the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And right now I'm curating a show called The New Reel for Edinburgh International Festival, with some astonishing artworks by artists working with artificial intelligence, and a series of reflections and debates on this strange new world we find ourselves in, which will be opening on the 17th of October.
Thank you, Drew. And next on the list is Gemma Neville.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here this evening. I lead Voluntary Arts Scotland, which is a development agency supporting all different types of self-led creative expression. My background is in human rights law, and I really believe there's an intrinsic relationship between art and activism. I am a writer, and I wrote a book about the interconnecting lives of neighbours on one street, Constitution Street, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provided the narrative structure for that. And I'm exploring a new project at the moment about the social dynamics, personal and political, of rooms, including these digital rooms that we're in just now. Good to be here.
Thank you, Gemma. And moving on to Dave O'Brien.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I have this really grand job title of Chancellor's Fellow in Cultural and Creative Industries, but it basically just means, I guess a bit like Drew, I'm an academic researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and most of my research covers creative industries and cultural policy. I'm one of the co-authors of a book that's coming out in, I think, 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks time, called Culture is Bad for You: Inequality in the Cultural and Creative Industries, that tries to sort of map out what the barriers are to everybody engaging with culture, everybody producing culture, and everybody benefiting from culture. So hopefully there'll be some crossovers with that this evening.
Thank you, Dave. And then last but definitely not least, Tamara Rocco.
Thank you, Janet. I am a dancer. I am artistic director of English National Ballet, and I also take part as a member of the board of the Creative Industries Federation. And I was asked to be part of the task force that advised the government during this period.
Thank you, Tamara. So we have a fantastic mix of experiences and some incredible voices in the room today. I'm going to ask you a short but quite complex question to start off with. And I'm going to ask Leonie to kick off with the question of how important is culture and creativity in today's world? There's a lot going on. There are many priorities that people have to grapple with. There are many challenges that people are dealing with in their lives right now. Does culture matter in the mix of all of that?
Yeah, of course. And I was thinking about this before, and I was kind of getting annoyed at myself for using the word unprecedented more times in the last few months than I've ever used, but also getting annoyed at myself for over the years using the expression art, culture, creativity, whichever one you're talking about, matters more now than ever. We used it in the context of the independence referendum in Scotland. We used it in the context of Brexit. We used it in the context of austerity, but actually we're all saying it again now, and this time I think probably we all really mean it. But I suppose the question is a tricky one, and I'm sure Dave will have views on this, and Drew as academics, that of course it matters, because I don't think you can be human without it. So even without people like me and the sort of career I've had, culture will still happen. It will still find a way to live and breathe and express. It's just the systems and the funding processes and the policy we put in place need to work harder than they've ever worked before now to make sure that it's not just some people that are able to make a professional living out of it, and it's not just some people that can access it and participate in it. And I suppose what we have exposed to us at the moment is that we're at that precipice point. We're at a point where people's incomes are so challenged that people are questioning their own utility as somebody that works in the cultural sector. And I find that hard with colleagues and friends that I've worked alongside and with for like 25 years, really questioning their value in society. Whereas I think their value is so huge and deep and meaningful. I'm not saying that we don't all have to work harder. I suppose the other bridge that I've crossed, if it's okay to just finish on this point, is that if we accept that culture is fundamental to being human and it exists even without the Creative Scotland's and the Arts Councils and people that make strategies when they're working in Scottish Government and those sorts of things, I think we also need to stop creating a binary division between what maybe a group like us think of as culture and what happens in everyday places and homes and in everyday lives, and really actually commit to that. We've talked about the rhetoric around that for a long time, but I was redeployed slightly in the role that I'm in now to help with the humanitarian impact of COVID when I was in Paisley at Renfrewshire Council. And actually I think I rather arrogantly went into that thinking it wouldn't have been a cultural experience. We were working around helping people in the most difficult circumstances with food and medicine, but actually I've come away from that experience thinking it was probably one of the most significant cultural experiences of my professional life, because people in communities across the UK and beyond have responded culturally to COVID, and they continue to. So that offers us a new plane in which to think differently.
Thank you, Leonie. And Tamara, you have been restricted beyond anything you would have ever expected in this current period in terms of running a ballet company. You've just opened a new building, which looks fantastic. It's in one of the most deprived areas of the UK, is my understanding. You've moved online. You've been teaching yourself to people across the world, and you've been running community classes for young people and other groups of people over this time. How important has that connection, has culture been to your participants and your audiences?
Incredibly important. I think it's been both one of the most challenging and exhausting times of my career, but also one of the most rewarding, without a doubt, in terms of how far we've been able to reach digitally to people that very often otherwise would not have engaged with us in the theatre. Like you say, we moved to Canning Town. We're between Canning Town, Tower Hamlets and Newham now is where our base is located. And we moved from Kensington, and we did it very much because we wanted to have an impact in local communities, and we felt we could have a much wider impact in these new boroughs. And a lot of the work that we had planned already, we haven't been able to do physically, which was obviously very disappointing. but we have managed to do some of it digitally, and we plan to expand that now in the autumn so that we can reach even more people. Obviously, for a dancer to not be able to go into a studio, to not be able to touch other people or partner other people is kind of almost the closest thing to a death sentence you can get. So everybody was training at home in their kitchens, and I thought that my duty was to share that training process with as many people as possible. Rather than doing it internal for the company, we just open it to everybody. And as you said, people from all over the world, we had 4 million people watching our classes and joining. Many of them for the first time in many years, people that had done ballet when they were young, or that had always dreamt of trying but never had the courage to step into a studio. Suddenly they felt that they could in their own home. So lots of messages of how important having a cultural connection every day was for their own well-being, for their own mental health, for their own feeling that they were part of a global community that had shared values, because obviously any cultural activity has shared values, and feeling that they were part of those values every morning. And to be fair, it was just as important to me, just having a motivation to get up every morning, knowing that people were waiting, was more enriching probably to me than anybody else. So it's been a very strange period that has made us as an organization, English National Ballet, and myself think again, not that we ever stop, but really much more focused what our aims are and what our focus should be when creating art, and how do we genuinely reach more people and people that can't access performances. So yeah, interesting.
Thank you. So hold that thought. We'll come back to that very point. How do we adjust during this period to engage and reach more people? Dave, you've written a book called Culture is Bad for You. How important is culture right now in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to speak to my other co-authors, but part of me does wonder whether we were a bit kind of provocative or too provocative with that title, given the current context. But actually, what's really interesting, reflecting on a couple of comments that I've heard already, is the things that we try and do in the book, which is map out what are the barriers to people making it, very little of which have anything to do with their talent, unfortunately, and can be drawn much more kind of closely to their gender, their race, or their social class, which are the three things that the three of us who are co-authors have expertise in. Obviously things like sexuality and disability matter as well. And then we're interested in audiences as well. And one of the things actually that Gemma put me in mind of was, at the start of the book, we draw from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has got a commitment to making sure people are allowed to take part in and express their cultural lives and their cultural selves. But actually what we see now, unfortunately, is a really clear, what academics call stratification of cultural engagement in formal cultural activities, which is dependent on things like social class, social status, levels of education, and the kind of things that unfortunately are done or engaged with least by the general population and are engaged with most by those who are most privileged are the things that get the highest social status and the most amount of government funding. And there is a really kind of serious imbalance, both to pick up on what Leonie was saying in terms of how we think about culture in hierarchical ways, and also in terms of what organisations are asked or perhaps expected to do in terms of opening themselves up, diversifying their audiences and diversifying their workforces. So although culture matters, an incredible amount, and there's really clear evidence that during the pandemic, people have become both, kind of more avid consumers and more active makers of culture, even that moment has been shaped by their social class, their gender, and their race. And again, you know, even in this kind of moment of hope, we still see really obvious kind of social divisions or social stratifications, which leaves, I think, a lot of work for the cultural sector to do, even at a point where, you know, it's really struggling, and we have to take really seriously the kinds of demands that the crisis is putting on organisations and individual practitioners.
Thank you. And so do you think that engagement with the arts empowers and influences us, or do you think it can be restricting? Gemma, do you want to take that question?
Okay, yeah, we're obviously having a moment, a collective moment. I'm thinking now of that famous Brecht quote about, will there be singing in the dark times? Well, yes, of course there will, about the dark times, because culture, our mark making, our trying to make sense of the world, and our be all and everything that we have the right to be, that creates a constructive space, doesn't it? It's a you and a me. We're in it just now. This is a conversation, a chance to turn around and see and understand things differently. And I think more than ever, when we're in this moment, culture and our participation in it can be an opportunity for a collective reset. You know, we're crossing borders in a way that some of the binary politics of the last few years hasn't allowed. And creative participation is an enabler to so many other things, you know, notably education, and we might go on to talk about that symbiotic relationship as well. But there's been also, I think, an interesting reimagining of the local, that because we're staying home to stay safe, we're having more interest and more agency in the areas where we work, because they're also the areas where we now socialise and have all of our day-to-day real interactions. So there's a real opportunity to reset. You know, here we are in the festival city in Edinburgh, and with this strange summer that's not been anything like it since 1947, it is forcing us to reimagine the relationship between the city and citizen, and that's a good thing. It's time for us to do that. And I think it's also showing up some of the structural power inequalities that have existed for a long time in publicly funded arts as well, that we used to have fairly low-grade positions of community engagement, what we used to call outreach as well, which are now that's got strategic importance attached to it, because culture is community, as others have spoken about before, and we're seeing large venues like North Edinburgh Arts, Whale Arts, Leith Theatre, Eden Court. They've been repurposed as community hubs for all sorts of recovery and resilience measures, which is really important, and I think will have a lasting impact on the relationship between people and place. And at Voluntary Arts, where I work, we've been hosting digital space every day, initially as a space for people to come together to network and to collaborate creatively, hopefully. But there was something very important about bearing witness to others' experience. And we know this stuff, the research has always been there about the social dynamics of doing creative things together. That's going to have a lasting impact, I think, for the future. So perhaps a hopeful note there to conclude in your question.
So Clarence, on that question of does culture empower us, I mean, you've had an extraordinary life, and you've dealt with a lot of things in your time, and music, I know your faith is very important to you, and music has been a consistent right throughout. How has music helped you do all the things that you've done since both before and since your accident? How important has it been to you as a human being over these years?
Well, I cannot put a value on that, Janet. It's when I had my accident, it was a car accident where I was conscious the whole time, And so I remember, you know, 1 second being a performer that was enjoying life and successful and having a voice and an outlet and a form of expression. And then seconds later, I was in a hospital ward where I was treated completely different in as much as I wasn't so much of an individual. People felt that they needed to tell me what I should be doing every step of the way. They would speak to me as if I was deaf. They would advise me on a lot of basic things, and I found myself catapulted into this world. I was in a room where I didn't receive any counselling or anything like that. But for me, the counselling came through music. I could not think of words or anything to express the way I was feeling, which is pretty similar to what we're going through now. There aren't words that can express always how we feel about things. And so music became such a counsel for me. It soothed my feelings. It became answers to questions that I didn't even know I had. And so continuing now in music, when I'm actually performing music, I'm totally unaware of this paralysis that I have, because the joy that I get from performing and playing music makes me unaware of other things around me. And so it is such a strange situation that we're in now, you know, not being able to put together all the pieces that make some of these things happen.
Thank you, Clarence. And that chimes very beautifully with an observation that was made by another academic from the University of Edinburgh called Nicola Osborne, who was performing as part of the Just Festival, which is a platform for social justice. And she did a little poll on her Zoom call, and she asked the audience to essentially say which of a number of activities they would most deploy a creative into if they had the choice. And she gave them options around things like what you've been watching, what you've been reading, what you've been listening to, and as well as how you've been feeling. And 68% of her audience all chose the how you've been feeling as been the single most thing that would make them feel empowered and stabilized, I suppose, in this particular period in time, which I guess chimes exactly with what you've been saying there. I'm going to move us on to talk about creative education. So how does creative education benefit society? It's a big question, important question. We're seeing a shift in terms of how education features in the curriculum. We're seeing a shift in terms of how teachers are deployed into the education system. Drew, I'll come to you on that point.
Thank you, Janet. I was putting my hand up, not out of any sense it might be my turn, but I just wanted to share a personal comment with Clarence, if I may. Two years ago, I broke my back really badly, and the doctor described my vertebrae as crushed and shattered, and I had a piece of bone pushed 1 millimeter away from my spinal cord, and if it had gone 1 millimeter further, I would have been paralyzed too. And I just want to say that you are an inspiration. So now I have to answer that question, which I'll try and remember. So education, creative education. I really agree with Leonie's point that I think the arts are the place where we ask profound questions, and in terms of whether there's a place for arts, surely it's more urgent now than ever. We've had a shock, a profound shock. I don't think things are going back to how they are. And we need the artists. We need people to decode this change, this situation. It's both a horror and as you mentioned, Gemma, an opportunity for a collective reset. And education is going to be fundamental there. And to me, it's about creative skills, sure, but it's also about how the arts can help us respond to this crisis now. So what is this crisis about? You know, I was reading Wolf Hall, and there was reference to an epidemic then that stopped Jane Seymour being the coronation of Jane Seymour. They couldn't allow people to gather in public places. So in a sense, a pandemic isn't new. What's new is its impact on our modern society. We're seeing how fragile our modern society is. Our modern society, our institutions, our conventions. And one aspect of that that particularly interests me is this shift that we've all had to make towards digital platforms and interfaces. My own background for 3 decades now has been in the digital arts, and for much of that time it's been quite a niche domain. It's been an incredible space to work in, but now what we're seeing is those issues that we've been grappling with for decades suddenly are thrust into the mainstream. Them in those issues, it's to do with how we can we create safe spaces online. How can we create delight? How can we have intimacy? How can we have safety? And all of these issues. And I think, you know, we've heard really eloquently from Dave about the entrenched inequality in society. And the bad news is that what we see with this shift, what we see in the digital domain, is that gets worse. There's many digital systems serve to amplify inequality, to centralize power, to centralize money. And that gives even more urgency to our response now. And that's why the place of education, the place of arts have to be at the center. We're not going to move forward only by addressing the epidemiology. We have to address the profound societal change, and if not through the arts, then how?
Thank you, Drew. And well, I'm going to try not to put words into your mouths, but clearly creative education gives us a great deal. Tamara, from your perspective, you've been a champion for arts education, and the skills that one develops through creative education, particularly with dance, are quite profound and I would say transferable. What do you think a creative education gives people at all stages of their lives, not just as young people?
Well, I think first and foremost, resilience, emotional resilience. If you manage to find a safe space from very early childhood where you can safely share your emotions in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be verbal, so that it is really open to all and all ethnicities and a really multicultural schools that we have, especially in London. If children can have that safe space to share their emotions, their questions, their fears outside of the home as well, with their colleagues, with friends, with people of their own age, and find perhaps not answers, but find at least consolation and commonality with other children. That gives emotional resilience, and I think that's very important right now and always. For me, certainly, the education reform where the concentration of on EBAC and the removal of so much of the cultural offering and the arts in the school has been one of the most devastating things that has happened in the last few years. Not only for the cultural organizations themselves, because obviously that was the entry point for many artists, that first education at school was for many people, especially from different backgrounds and from lower income backgrounds. For many, that is the one opportunity to encounter the arts. If their family doesn't have the means or the traditions to go to the theater, to a museum, to listen to a concert, if the school can provide that, that is the one opportunity where we can really be more open and democratic as a society to allow children from any background to enter the many professions that the arts can offer. On stage, behind the stage, producing all kinds of professions. And since this is this enormous industry in this country that grows more than any other, why not be part of the curriculum? Why not allow everybody to have access to it as soon as possible? So I certainly have always been very clear about all the different benefits, health benefits from moving if you're doing any kind of physical activity, the many benefits of music, mathematical benefits actually that music can have. We could go on for hours, but I think more important than that is the right of the children to have access to the arts, and that has to be at school to ensure that everybody can have that access.
Thank you. And Leonie, do you want to comment on that subject? And is it different in Scotland?
Yes, we have something called Curriculum for Excellence, which does attempt to position creativity in its role across all subjects. So the relationship between mathematics and music, but I think it's been eroded as well. I think every teacher and kid that's in the state system will tell you that private schools have a much better arts education, and the chat out there is that Ian has the best arts education in the whole of the world, and you see that on our stages and in our screens. It's not to undermine the talent of some of those guys, but I think Tamara used the word right, Gemma has, Dave has, as well as the right of our young people. I think we have to shift how we see schools. I think the stuff that's happened in the last 2 weeks around kids, and actually throughout this whole pandemic, and I'm speaking I suppose as a parent, but just as an observer, has been just really, really worrying and destabilising. We have not thought about their rights and their experience, and our schools have become processes for attainment. And so we've got into a transactional kind of almost understanding around what a kid is for and what their education is for, that we're just creating something that we think will be employable later on and not their self. And I'm nervous about using the word soul on a Zoom call when I don't know who's out there, but I think it is more just the kind of basic humanity that every child has a right to. So if we can start to think of schools as cultural organisations, I think it opens up different possibilities. And I suppose I wouldn't just talk about maybe the more traditional arts education. I would, I think, get into the territory that Drew was talking about, but also include digital and design in that we have, not only have we lost our more traditional arts education and specialist teachers around that in early years in primary school, but we also were a great design country with engineers, and now we're at risk of not having those sorts of thinkers as well. So yeah, I agree with everything what everybody else has said, but I think at system scale we need to sort of rethink, I guess it is the values and the sort of people we want to have in our country and what we can do to support that. And I think the arts is an enabler of that. But I think, if it's okay to say this, I think the art, because we've talked a little bit about we've all hinted a little bit about the vulnerability of the current cultural workforce, but also that it's not diverse enough. We've talked a little bit about the narrowness of the audience out there, and they're all really, really important things. But I think there is a fundamental principle upon which a progressive society needs to be made, and that is you support arts, design, creativity, and culture in its most broadest, because you believe in it in its inherent good. You believe it is a force for good. You believe it can be challenging and critical, and angry and joyful, and radical. And it's from that point of I suppose stabilization and security and confidence that you can make the difference in education, in health, in our sense of place, and all those sorts of things. I think we're getting into a conversation where we are again fighting for our case, for our right to be here, for our right to be paid as a sector. And we've been doing that for a long time. And you said at the very beginning, we always talk about what we all cost and very little about what we value. But for the first time ever in my life, I think the cost of losing that is visible. And the inequality in society is more visible than ever before. And it's shocking maybe that it's taken a pandemic for that to happen. So yeah, in terms of schools, they're the greatest opportunity we have to create equality.
Thank you, Leonie. And maybe, Dave, that does make sense of your title of your book, and certainly the thematic content within it, which is all about inequality of access, as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I guess we struggled with in the book, and we struggle with in the conclusion a little bit, is how far do we go with this kind of critique? And, you know, it's not a problem with what Leonie has mapped out, but I guess the reality of kind of carving out that space for culture means that you hand over kind of social resources, whether it's, you know, financial or social status, to people who are unfortunately, you know, really kind of privileged already and are, you know, essentially the kind of the top of society. And indeed, actually, there are moments where I think we should be talking almost exclusively in financial language about culture, because when we get into, I mean, academics call it the field, but, you know, when we start to kind of interview people and talk to people about their working lives as artists, musicians, theatre practitioners, as you know, digital creatives, we see a strong relationship between, particularly for younger people, between social class and their experiences of working for free, and, you know, the kind of shared solidarity of, you know, oh, none of us get paid, it's terrible, actually breaks down into those, you know, from more privileged social starting points are the ones who are working for free by taking a show to Edinburgh, you know, taking a major financial risk, whereas the ones from more, you know, kind of humble backgrounds are the ones who are doing student films that go nowhere, you know, are kind of getting exploited. And again, you know, it's something that I think we need to be cautious of. I suppose the question of how saturated is art and culture in our contemporary society, which is an unequal contemporary society with that inequality, and where are the kind of the moments where we might intervene to make things fairer. And again, I mean, schools are really crucial to that, because, you know, the kinds of differences we see between the fee-paying sector and the state sector, even where in theory, you know, two schools are saying that they're doing artistic and cultural education, actually it's not the same thing at all. So yeah, they'd be my sort of, I guess, notes of caution and kind of queries about, you know, how much can we separate off our cultural sector, our cultural system, from social inequalities, and how much actually are those two implicated with one and each other.
Okay, Gemma, you want to come in there?
Thank you. I totally agree with what's just come before about never taking schools for granted. Again, and also some of the recent protest, which by the way is a word that means testimony. Again, this bearing witness thing. This protest that we've seen from young people themselves articulating their right to a fair educational process has highlighted how reductionist some of the output-driven values of which what we have currently in our formal education system. And I also want to pick up on what I see some of the comments and questions in the audience chat box here about, are we overemphasizing the instrumentalization of the arts? And I think it's and, not or. You know, the intrinsic benefit of investing in the arts in school and in formal education settings is because it helps develop our basic sense of self and expression, all we can be, but also because it exercises the empathy muscle. And there's, while the constant anxiety and the grief work of these last few months has felt exhausting and not been therefore hugely productive for lots of us in terms of creative output, I've found real solace in reading fiction, you know, and that can take you to other places. So the value of an arts education is you can go anywhere in the world from your armchair. It literally is a passport to other lives and to other places, which is just so important at the moment. And the school estate as a part of our community infrastructure, if it works well, isn't just for the benefit of young people. It's a space for all different types of learning, and therefore that intergenerational connection in terms of informal learning. So music education, for instance, music tuition, the way in which that can foster lifelong participation. We've got a strong folk and traditional music culture here in Scotland, and yeah, so it takes a village to raise a child. We are all invested in this education experience and hopefully learning all our lives.
Thank you, Gemma. So we are going to take a very short break, and when we come back, we're going to look at the points that are coming through on the audience question and answer. We're going to play a short film which just brings Edinburgh back to life from last year's festival, which is just under 5 minutes long, and then we're going to come back for the second half of this evening's event. So I'd ask all the panelists to make sure that you're back in place as soon as the film finishes, which is, as I say, it's just between 4 and 5 minutes long. So thank you to everyone, and to see you in 5 minutes' time. So welcome back, everybody. Going back to creative education, what do we need to do to get the arts back into schools and back into the curriculum? How are we going to make that happen? Who would like to have a go at answering that? No, I can't hear anybody. Leonie.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, I think there is arts education and there's creativity in education. So we have an interesting project that has made me think a bit differently in Paisley. So we have a 10-year project partnership between Glasgow School of Art and a secondary school in Paisley called Castlehead High School. So on paper it would be fed from primary schools that are in areas of multiple deprivation. The head teacher there is one of the most interesting and inspiring cultural leaders I've come across, and he's a head teacher of a secondary school. And during Paisley's bidding process to be UK City of Culture, they got together with the art school and came up with 10 years is a long time, and the sort of funding cycles that we're all dealing with, you know, it's risky for both organisations, and we haven't been overly bureaucratic in the governance of it or in the kind of outputs and the outcomes. It's a commitment though to see how both the art school and the secondary school can learn from one another. The head teacher, and I think he will achieve this year, will establish the School of Scotland's first school of creativity. And I suppose it's a bit of a juxtaposition to the schools of performing arts that we have in Scotland. I think they're a model, but I think, and they produce amazing young people and the teaching's outstanding in them, but I also think they could evolve to sort of rethink what we mean by creativity and culture and things like design in certain different ways. So the partnership in Paisley is one that I think has opened up not only a really interesting kind of professional exchange, but it has taken, I suppose, what is studio-based learning in the art school and applied it across subjects. So it's not just within the art department, it's in English, it's in computing science, it's in maths, and you have the teachers and the art school staff learning from one another. Every child in that school from first year on has access to the art school building, or it did, obviously pre-COVID and pre the last fire. But it's the ambition and I suppose the values within it and the commitment to creative education and to the young people and to their aspirations, which I've been really struck by. I heard Darren McGarvey talk at something about 2 years ago, and he said something that it never left me, that the aspiration in our young people remains largely the same until the ages of between 10 and 12. So no matter of socioeconomic background, all kids want to be, you know, a film star or a footballer or an actor, but then something starts to happen in their sense of their own destiny and their own future from around 10. And it's a little thing, but I don't like the language of cultural and social capital, but it's an easy way to understand what we're meaning here, I suppose. But just by giving access to some of those kids who sometimes don't even come into the town centre of Paisley to go to the Museum of the Abbey, to get access to the art school and its buildings and what it represents, what it's emblematic of in society is really important. It shifts their aspiration, their sense of what's possible for them. So it's not just the hard stuff like skills and knowledge and things around resilience, it's also your sense of hope and where you can see yourself and how that society values you. And it also changes the art school. I think it changes the demographic of who they think is a potential student. So that's one locally led example of how you can rethink how different stages of the education sector work together, and how we can create different sorts of collaborations and partnerships across society, public and private, to rethink what we mean by education. I don't think all the answers need to sit with those people who have education in their job titles. I think it's in all of us to help think about that. But there is probably something basic within the classroom and in the curriculum that we need to look at. And I think the exams stuff that's just playing out in England today and played out, you know, up here over the last couple of weeks, we're at all these points in time, and I think people will look a bit harder and we will rethink. It is the time to do it, but danger is we're also exhausted by the process we've all been going through. Where's the energy going to come from to do it and to innovate? That's what we must keep. We must keep that innovation coming forward.
Indeed, and I want to bring us on to some of the questions that have come through. There's a question from Stephen Berryman around, is there a risk of overemphasizing the instrumentality of the arts when we advocate for their place in education? And will this instrumentality at risk is it at risk of undermining the desire for the arts to be valued? Tamara, do you want to take that? Do you, if we talk about the value of the arts in terms of skills or all of the human aspects of the arts that we've been discussing, is there a risk that we don't value art for art's sake and everything that it can be for us?
I think it's a really good question, and I think very often the arts are pushed to make the case in languages that are fit for the listener. As in, when we talk to government, we talk a lot about financial benefit and economic benefit, and very often that feels very forced to us, because there is obviously a financial benefit and economic benefit of the arts as an industry, but that is not what motivates most of us to join the arts in the first place. And so it's sometimes uncomfortable how we shape our own conversation about the value of the arts, but I think we do it with the best intentions, and that is to convince whoever is the listener, and very often the policymakers, that we do have a value, and then we end up bending over backwards and kind of ignoring the intrinsic value of it to make whatever case we feel will be more successful. And I think, following from Leonie, I think we all have examples of how cultural institutions are having initiatives in collaboration with the schools, local schools, like you said at the beginning, Janet. We working in Newham, in our hamlets, and we're working with the local schools, and we're trying to kind of provide the cultural education that is not in the curriculum. But I think we have to also recognize that that is something that we all feel we ought to do, and it's something we feel is our responsibility, but it's often not the reason for the organizations to exist in the first place, which is to create art or to create cultural experiences. As I say, it's not that we don't believe in it. I think we all believe in it. We all want to do it. But I think there has to be a certain responsibility from policymakers. And we have to try and demand, or that those decisions that remove those that's part of the education for the school will be reviewed, especially after this period and what we have seen, the complete focus on exam results that are so that were brought in under the umbrella that they were going to make education more democratic, and that they were going to allow people of any background to have access to higher education, and it has been proven not to be the case. So I think this is a good opportunity to maybe make the case for the intrinsic value of the arts and culture in the curriculum, as well as all the activity that we all do in collaboration with schools.
And that takes us neatly onto the next question, which is talks about what about the professionalization of creativity, and how do we balance people's right to earn a fair wage from their art practice and other people's right to choose to be creative? And the question's just moved in front of my eyes, without earning and how does one exist without undermining the other? And I'm just going to link that into a question that I thought of as I was planning for today, in asking the panel, how do you see the roles of artists and creatives evolving over these coming months and years, and what needs to happen to enable people to create the conditions for artists to be able to work effectively? Dave, do you want to have a go at that as a starter for 10, and then I'll bring in whosoever would like to raise their hands?
Yeah, like a very short answer to the first question, I think, is to do with changing the kinds of hierarchies and associations we have with different cultural forms. And I think the Arts Council in England's new strategy around, trying to open up culture and creativity for all is an interesting document in that respect. And obviously up in Scotland, there's an ongoing process to think about how we can kind of measure engagement, measure creative activity, which some colleagues and I are part of at the moment. I think in relation to changing of hierarchies, that is to do with how we define culture. We also need to challenge hierarchies within the cultural sector. Now, one of the things that's really kind of obvious to everybody working, whether it's in the visual arts or in the film industry, in television, in the theatre industry, is that there are huge amounts of money around the system. Whether it's an investor putting up capital for a film or a theatre production, who's bearing the risk of uncertainty because it's not clear what will be a hit or not, or whether it's a star who can command high fees based on the kind of revenue they'll bring in. Individuals and sometimes companies are making huge amounts of money in the cultural sector, whilst actually the experience of paid labour for the majority of workers is really poor, actually, and in some cases there's no paid labour at all. And I think that is something that we need to think about. Usually the moment would be a kind of a recommendation that government should fund the arts better, but actually I wonder actually whether individual kind of regulatory approaches to cultural labour markets, coupled with things like stronger unions and stronger things like collective bargaining agreements. So things like the Artists Union up in Scotland and in England, which have come about in the last kind of decade or so, I think are particularly interesting alternative models to just expecting government to kind of fund the arts better, although better funding for the arts would deal with some of these questions of pay.
Thank you. And we've got a couple of questions here going back to schools. How can we change the value for work in schools, particularly for children within the theatre and dance sector? How can we bring culture and performance back into schools safely under COVID-19? Do we recognise schools as a place for quality performance? Clarence, you have worked in many schools. What are your views on those points?
Well, speaking from experience, I had the opportunity to go to Westminster to talk about money going into schools and disabled schools, special needs schools. And really, the job that I had to do in this opportunity was to express that what happens in the arts is not a game. It's not a case of filling time and having a nice, and I've seen young people, disabled or special needs young people who are completely in their own world, often because they haven't yet found a way of expressing or seeing other things. And so one of the projects I was involved was taking some young people with disabilities, mentally and whatever, and introducing them to maybe some musical instruments. This is down at a primary age, and it is amazing how at the beginning they are looking down at the floor and not aware of things around them. And when one has to participate in some of these arts, slowly they realize that they have to maybe react with somebody else or wait their turn or participate in these different ways, and they become aware of the world around them. And so some of these skills and awareness and training that we have in the arts, it is lifetime values that can really open up these skills. And it's not a case of just wasting time and playing games. You know, it's amazing how these young people have almost sat upright with eyes wide open and see the world for the first time and appreciate the opportunity sometimes of a platform where they can speak and say what they think musically or through arts, and other people listen for a change.
Thank you, Clarence. And moving us on, the question around international, how do you think we as artists or members of the cultural industry will face this new paradigm of the world in which we're internationally more connected than ever, but at the same time the free flow of people across the globe and the intercultural exchange this implies is more complex than ever? Drew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that question. Thank you. I'll do so just filtered through a response to Clarence. I thought that was a really vivid account of that physical embodiment and interaction that the arts can really empower, and that also reminded me of in a different way of a comment from Tamara, when Tamara, you talking about not being able to rehearse and the loss of that physical encounter with dance and with your discipline. You even described it as a near-death experience. So we kind of had the, you know, both sides of that. And we've had a couple of questions coming in about online culture and online experience. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're now faced, many of us for the first time, with losing that co-presence and having to create different kinds of encounters and different kinds of exchange. And, you know, that robs us of so much. And yet again, Tamara, your example, I thought that was a really powerful account of the Janus face nature of digital interfaces, because you both had a near death experience, but then you were able to reach these millions of people. And we saw both the power of some of these tools and what we're losing. And I think that really helps us answer some of those questions coming in, because, you know, Tamara's point illustrated so powerfully that international dimension. And we can sometimes get there. I don't know if this was your experience, Tamara, but almost by accident, you know, online, because it is already so international. It is a global audience, and we experience the local and global in different ways. So some of the questions coming in is about whether digital cultural organizations can develop that international dimension. It's asking other questions coming in also about so how cultural organizations can give access to people who can't otherwise attend, you know, physically attend events. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a proliferation of experiments in precisely those questions. We're starting now to be able to access venues again. So we're seeing productions that are, you know, we've seen a whole slew of them produced at people's homes. Now we're seeing them with limited access to professional setups in studios. And so we're seeing these different lenses placed on the physical experience, the way that art is constructed, some of the technologies involved, the physical space that's involved, the working practices involved, and so many creative approaches to create delight and engage audiences. But we're also facing the challenge that we're left with. Many art forms can't be translated online. And so it's going to be interesting to see as we move to the next chapter, how people are going to take some of those insights and move back into venues, but maybe with some of those insights carried into their disciplines.
Yes, and there's been a lot of discussion in many of the conversations I've attended around liveness and the importance of liveness to performance, and that shared experience of people in a room together, breathing the same air, which is a phrase that I've heard again and again on different conversations, which of course is something we simply can't do just at the moment. So another question from an audience member here. So interested in panel's views. So this is really a Scotland question. I'm interested in your views on the dearth of collaborations, cultural education in rural areas, for example, the north of Scotland, with its wildly dispersed population. So many arts communities are at breaking point, trying to fill the gaps. Leonie, you led for the Scottish Government for a period in relation to cultural strategy, the development of the cultural strategy. How would you respond to that?
So the question is, I suppose it was building, picking up maybe on my more urban example of the School of Art and Paisley, and that they're like 7 miles apart from one another. So it's a good question, and I've been watching, like many people, Eden Court, as they've kind of been wrestling with transforming themselves into something at the heart of kind of the community and its resilient response. So yeah, I sympathise. I think we probably do expect an awful lot of very small organisations that are run by 1 or 2 people, often part-time, probably also rely on volunteers to do an awful lot, and we are all kind of talking maybe rather kind of blithely around that. So I guess it's back to the question of 10 minutes ago, is there's got to be a balance struck, hasn't there, of what the curriculum does, what happens formally within a school, and then where the cultural sector can come in and add value. It's kind of what Tamara was hinting at, I think, or not hinting, saying quite directly that, you know, their purpose is to create, and then they, because they of, I suppose, funding requirements, but also because they want to, other organisations go in and do other things. So I think we probably do need to find a greater equilibrium where we're not wringing everything out of very small, very fragile organisations that are going hand to mouth on a very short funding cycle. And that actually we're understanding, this isn't just in culture, this is across the third sector. I would imagine we're understanding that those smaller organisations play a really fundamental role that requires long-term sustainability within them, because what they do is vital. But then we also need to go back to that question of what's in the curriculum and what's happening in schools. But I do think there's something interesting about, if you kind of rethink the schools, the cultural building, and as a venue where not just performing art can take place. I think performing arts alongside other art forms and design and those sorts of things. So yeah, I feel the pain in that question, and I don't have the immediate answer. Even if I was head of cultural strategy at the Scottish Government, we don't have the answers when you're in jobs like that. You just have to try and work out what levers you've got. Dave was kind of saying this, what levers do you have in certain roles, and what areas of influence have you got where you can try and make the most difference at that time. And I think we're at that point where we can all try and be as influential as we can.
Thank you. And we've got a really interesting question next from Ellie Tate, which let's see how we go. I've got some thoughts on it. Can anyone explain why the arts should be funded rather than self-sustaining businesses? So how can we even begin to achieve equitable access and culture that's meaningful to all when the gatekeepers hold the funds and decide what projects or artists are worthy of funding? So big question there. Who would like to have a go at that one? Shall I start? Shall I set the ball rolling? And I hope you'll join in. I mean, I think first first point is simply that some art forms cost a lot more money than most people can afford. We've got a representative from ballet company and an orchestra in the room, and if everybody paid the market price for those tickets, it would be very limiting indeed, and even more exclusive, I think Dave would say, than he is currently witnessing in relation to how the arts work. Now you're going to argue back at me.
Just very quickly, like, you're completely correct that ticket prices and, you know, attendance prices important here, but I do think that's something that we forget, that, you know, people will invest huge amounts of time and money in things they're interested in, and people will not pay for things that they don't care about, and they won't put time into things they don't care about. So I do think sometimes the ticket price discussion can be a bit of a red herring, and actually there are, you know, kind of broader discussions about, you know, keeping institutions free from particular kinds of commercial or philanthropic interests, you know, allowing institutions to be risk-taking in particular contexts, because the price stuff, it sometimes forgets that, look, you know, people will pay several £100s to, you know, go and see a gig that is entirely in the commercial sector, and, you know, often we're not too bothered about subsidising that at all, and yet, you know, that ticketing defence is used in the case of opera or
Okay, Gemma, do you want to come in?
Thanks. It's tricky, this stuff, and I don't have the answers by any means, but I do think what gets funded is quite a sort of mirror up to society about what we value. So why is it that a national opera company would be seen as more representative than hip hop or drum and bass? Like, let's ask those questions, because culture is the fluid conversation, and I think anyone who's received public funding, which includes venues, has a responsibility, civic and economic and social, to meet people where they are. So it's not about welcoming people into the big shiny building, and then the current crisis, you know, really shows that, with the big shiny buildings largely being closed. It's about meeting people and being part of the cultures where they are, including in schools and in living rooms. So you see a huge sort of gulf and self-confidence, I think, often about boundaries and permissions in which people think they can step over a threshold of what essentially they own. These are our spaces, as members of the public. They're not the preserve of those of us who feel like they have the self-confidence to always be stepping over the threshold. So yeah, culture with communities, plural and diverse, not for and done to. It's an old point, but I think it's a really important one. And if I may also, I got the privilege of being unmuted here. I guess one of the reasons we're all quite tired with the digital space is, you know, the flattening of the grid, is that it's an inherently uncreative process. Here I am using my hands because that's how I talk. But I think we would be having different and richer conversations if we were knitting while we were doing this, or we were sketching, and sometimes we are prone to doodle at the side, or even to have a sing-along together. There's something about the making that allows us to say and hear the difficult things, to engage with that mess in a way that's civic and respectful, and perhaps even makes space for this trauma, you know, the grief work of loss, which we've just all been through, and we're in the churn at the moment. It's difficult to make sense of.
Yeah, and I think I said I'll bring you in tomorrow on another one of these calls, that we use more energy to actually process two-dimensional images on our screens than we would in sharing energy in a room. So that makes us very tired as well. Tamara, let's get back to value.
Oh, I just wanted to share maybe for the person that asked the question, where does the money go? And the fact is, the money goes on people. A choir of 60 singers, a philharmonic orchestra of 90 players, a corps de ballet of 100 dancers. That's where basically the money goes. And in fact, to Dave's point, the reality of why those businesses don't make financial sense is because, thankfully, over the last many decades, they've been unionized, and dancers and orchestra players and singers are paid fairly for their work, and they have pension schemes, and they have insurance, and they have full-time contracts, and they're employed properly. And that has meant that as a business, since we are also not under the patronage of a royal family, that means that they are no longer able to not function without funding. I think the second part of that question that I think is important is when we look at funding models like the United States, where there is either no funding at all, or very, very little one. What we see is that there is very little creativity. And what I mean by that is there is very little risk-taking. There is near no investment in unknown artists. Companies, and I speak specifically about opera and ballet companies, get private funding most of the time in return to guarantee success. Very few people want to give their personal money to the unknown. So time and time again, we rehearse classics that are a guarantee in the box office by known choreographers or known composers or known designers. And what we see in Britain is precisely the opposite, that thanks to the public funding, great organizations like the National Theatre can invest in very young, unknown, unsuccessful artists. And that, that we can have many other opportunities to take those risks, and that those artists and creatives then they'll go on to feed the very successful and profitable film industries or musical industries or whatever. So I think it is a big question and a complicated one, and that mainly is about people.
Thank you, Tamara. Another question here, which I'll pray-see. How, as cultural organisations and artists, are we going to recognise the inequalities and cultures that have not been represented in society fairly? And I suppose I would link that to a question I've got around, is there widespread understanding of the value of the arts and creative industries, and what do we need to do to generate that? Because it strikes me that we're not going to solicit political support until people, citizens, value the arts in a really lively way. And whose responsibility is it to frame and drive that change, and what needs to happen to generate that buy-in? So lots of quick fire thoughts there. We've got 5 minutes left. How are we going to make it work? Who would like to have a go at that? Dave, you're an advisor on cultural policy. What do we need to do to generate that shift so that we can frame a belief system where people value the arts and are therefore comfortable and confident that public investment should be made to widen access?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. I did some work with the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee down in Westminster last year, and we were really struck by all of the evidence that came in seemed to show that cultural organisations really get the idea of kind of connecting with the public, having public legitimacy, doing things that what one of the earlier questions was about, kind of instrumentalising the arts. Well, actually, most of the evidence submissions suggested that what used to be called instrumentalising the arts, most of the cultural institutions the committee heard from thought that that was like their bread and butter now, doing education, doing community development, having forms of kind of curatorial or maybe programming practice that weren't just the vision of a cliched kind of middle-class origin, older white man, and were more participatory, were the kind of ways they'd seek to operate. And I suppose in a hopeful way, it's more of that, and encouraging organisations to kind of carry on the routes that maybe some of them have already started down. But I think on the other side, I think there does have to be, you know, really serious questions asked for cultural organisations that maybe aren't taking these questions of legitimacy, you know, kind of seriously. And, you know, there have been moments in Scotland and moments in England when, you know, kind of radical reforms have been, you know, proposed, and they are really kind of difficult to get through. So in the English context, because there's been a major, you know, new strategy put forward, it was really interesting to watch Arts Council of England say, the COVID pandemic doesn't mean we don't want to think about creativity for all. It doesn't mean we want to stop questions about why is ethnic diversity so poor in some of the, you know, upper regions of our elite institutions. You know, why is it that there's still this kind of bias towards London in funding and things like that. So I think, as well as the kind of, you know, celebrating the journey that some organisations are on, I think actually, you know, saying to other organisations, and coming back actually to what Tamara was saying, you know, maybe you shouldn't be given the privilege of investing in risk taking, because actually the kinds of risks that organisations that aren't responding and aren't taking legitimately seriously, they're not really risks at all, actually, you know, and they're, you know, kind of investing in people who maybe are the usual suspects, younger versions of the usual suspects. So that might be one way, you know, kind of linking the ability or the privilege of taking artistic and cultural risks to the need to kind of transform the business model and transform the decision-making model for a cultural organisation.
Thank you, Dave. So we're almost there. I want to thank Jill and Greg for their wonderful interpretation throughout this event. And I want to thank all of our panelists. And then before we say goodbye, just going back to that question of value, I suppose one of the things that hasn't come up at all in all of our conversations about value through this series is prevention and what investment in culture does in terms of saving on costs in relation to other things like health or the justice system. It seems to me that there's an argument there as well in relation to the value of the arts and what they give to us as human beings. And going back to Newham Council and Canning Town, I just had a quick look tomorrow. The residents in Newham suffer from poor health. 17% of the population suffers from long-term illness, 17.5% on income support, 49.7% of 16 to 74 years old people have no formal qualifications. And I guess part of your work is about trying to begin to redress some of those realities through different sorts of opportunities in terms of cultural engagement, which perhaps in time might alleviate the need for spend in order to rectify some of those critical issues. So I will leave you with that thought and thank everyone again. That was a really, really interesting conversation. This is the moment when we say goodbye. It's a kind of horrible cut-off point where we just have to say goodbye and thank everyone for participating, including our audience. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.